During the 5th generation console race, Nintendo and Sega, the only two titans of console gaming in the market, were met by the only one that could topple them, which was Sony. With the introduction of the PlayStation, Sony's entry into the console race introduced the concept of using your home console as something more than just a gaming device, because it allowed it to be used as a CD player, and it was actually quite good at doing just that for the money during the mid-90s. But rather hastily, Sega pioneered the 6th generation console race with the introduction of the Dreamcast in 1998. Then Sony made its insanely lucrative return in the year 2000 with the PlayStation 2, while Nintendo was gearing up for the release of the Gamecube 1 year after that. The three titans of the console gaming industry were more than ready to enter the scene, but there was still one more challenger left: Microsoft. As such, days before Nintendo could even answer Sony and Sega, this is when the Xbox invaded the console gaming scene without remorse. Microsoft isn't new to gaming at all, as they are the creators of the most popular operating system at the time and still to this day: Windows. PC gaming was obviously relevant throughout the 90s, and even then, PCs were considered to be more powerful than home consoles. But this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. What made consoles more appealing were the exclusives and the accessibility that comes from having cheaper and easier to use hardware. The Xbox derived a lot of inspiration from Microsoft's experience with computers, as this is easily the most PC-like console that we had ever gotten at the time. On the outside, the Xbox did become the largest home console at the time because of everything that it featured. On the front, you will find a DVD drive, 4 controller ports, a disc eject button, and a power button. This DVD drive was quite important because this is what helped the PlayStation 2 sell so well throughout the early years. This meant that while the Gamecube and the Dreamcast opted for proprietary storage solutions that could only hold up to 1.47 gigabytes for the Gamecube's disc or 1 gigabyte for the Dreamcast disc, the Xbox used full-size DVD discs that could hold up to 4.7 gigabytes for a single-layer disc, or even 8.5 gigabytes on a double-layer disc. This meant less compromises when it came to what developers could fit into these discs, and the Xbox took full advantage of that. The Xbox even had DVD support similar to the PlayStation 2, which meant that you could watch movies on it, but you needed to purchase a separate playback kit in order for it to actually work. Then on the back, you will find a power connector, a cooling vent, AV out for composite and component connections, and finally a built-in Ethernet port. This was very important as online was prevalent during this generation, and every console at this time was technically capable of it. But Sony and Microsoft were the ones that really made use of this feature. However, it's what is inside that adds credence to this console being the closest to a PC at the time. The Xbox comes with either an 8 to 10 gigabyte hard drive built into this system. The other competitors only used memory cards as a storage solution for game data and anything else, while the Xbox was emphasizing the importance of internal storage. So compared to how little data these memory cards could hold, 8 gigabytes ensures that you will never run out of space for your save files. But this size was also important because it lets you even download games onto it, which was a very new concept for home consoles at the time. Although you would have to rip the data from a disk rather than downloading it from the internet. The only console that did anything like this was the PlayStation 2, but you had to purchase the hard drive separately and even the network adapter if you wanted to download anything onto it. Even then, you could only do it for very specific games that required it, such as Final Fantasy XI, but the Xbox just came with one. This is also useful for installing DLC. Another interesting fact about the Xbox as a platform is that it supports 4-way multiplayer locally, which was common around this era, but it is an advantage that it holds over the PlayStation 2 that only supported 2-way local multiplayer. Obviously, this is done through their controller, the Duke. This controller is absolutely monstrous. This is the launch controller, and it was not received very well because it is quite unwieldy, and in some regions it was definitely not going to become a popular contender, more specifically in Japan. So in a quick turnaround, Microsoft developed a much smaller controller known as the S-Type controller. This controller is still quite large, but it was still smaller than the Dreamcast controller, and while it did also have a somewhat unique way of gripping it, this design lends itself better for a more natural hold. Muscle memory will probably only require 1 or 2 more attempts at grabbing this controller before acclimating to the shape, and to where your fingers are supposed to rest. And I did mention the Dreamcast controller a moment ago, and it is somewhat crazy to realize that these are very similar in some ways. And this is because Microsoft worked alongside Sega to develop the Dreamcast, which is an important bit of information because it makes a lot of sense why they seem to share a lot of that DNA in terms of their design. Just a quick note. Moving on. The position of the left stick is quite similar, being towards the top left instead of the bottom left, and the D-pad sits right under it. These both use ABXY in the same order from controllers. These even have 2 accessory ports on these controllers for whatever you'd like to use with them. You even get those lower single-row shoulder buttons that have a similar way of using them. What I mean is that you're meant to grip these controllers as if to reach these buttons on the back in almost the same way. But the biggest difference is that the Xbox's controller is much more comfortable to use. The 2 slots on top were used for memory cards in case you wanted to transfer save data from Xbox to Xbox, add a microphone or headset for voice chat, connect a keyboard to this, and even use a microphone for games like Karaoke Revolution. Now thankfully, you do not need to add a rumble pack because this already has one built in. Another great feature about this controller is that it has a breakout cable, and the only purpose of this cable is just to ensure that if someone tripped over your cable, that it wouldn't just yank the whole setup with it, as it would just come apart. But this is basically just one very long USB cable with a proprietary connection at the end. This controller probably isn't my favorite, but it's pretty good and a reasonable compromise from having the original Duke controller to something that is much more manageable. One thing that was also quite interesting is the inclusion of these 2 function buttons, particularly for the S-type controller, as it has these buttons on the bottom right of the controller. Start and back were on the bottom left side. These additional buttons have their own functions depending on the game, but they weren't really meant to be buttons that you would reach for too often. And as such, this was a concept that was likely replaced with 4 shoulder buttons instead of 2 on future controllers. But the Xbox's controllers really are incredibly interesting concepts to dive into, considering that so much can be said about their journey from their initial design to their last controller. And of course, one of the coolest things about getting an Xbox and turning it on for the first time is seeing the screen and the menu screen just a few seconds later. This menu is something special in terms of simplicity, but also with just how aggressive its design is. This feels like a real gamer's dashboard, if I have ever seen one. Frankly, I think every console released during the 6th generation had such a simple, yet charming menu experience that simply isn't replicated today. So considering everything that this console features, it was more than reasonably priced as it was basically a PC, and I am infinitely grateful to Microsoft for making this such a simple console to disassemble. These consoles would cost roughly $425 to make, and Microsoft sold these for $299. It's not uncommon for companies to sell hardware at a loss because the gains were usually in the software, but this was a great move in the grand scheme of things as it made it reasonably digestible to purchase one and cement the Xbox name into people's minds, and most importantly, people's homes. The design of the Xbox was pretty unique within the context of console gaming, but it really was one of the most interesting competitors that we had ever seen up to that point. For one, I think that the Xbox is a piece of tech that deserves to be remembered for its hardware, but also because of the unique experiences that you could get on the Xbox on top of it being such a smooth console to develop for. This is what made the Xbox so good for gaming. The original Xbox is incredibly interesting. This console featured a custom Pentium 3 CPU, which is a modified computer processor, and on top of that, the Xbox worked with DirectX. This combination of features made it easier for developers to develop games for the Xbox more efficiently, as it's a fairly familiar platform to those who develop games on PC, but it was also useful for porting games that would usually be on PC onto the Xbox. However, one thing that I really appreciate that the Xbox is capable of is becoming a more efficient gaming box due to its ability to utilize the cache from the Xbox rather than solely relying on the RAM. This allowed for faster and smoother experiences when gaming, particularly around loading times. So when compared to every other console of that era, the Xbox definitely felt faster because it just was, as every other competitor relied on memory cards and just reading games off of the disc while relying on the RAM itself for loading. An Xbox could also support resolutions of anywhere between 480i and 1080i, but most games did end up playing at 480p, even if some games did support 720p, even if this wasn't always consistent. I think the Xbox was the only console remotely capable of doing this back then. As such, when it came to visuals and performance, the Xbox did have noticeably better offerings in this regard. While games that managed to take advantage of the motion engine on the PlayStation 2 did manage to look a bit better and function better on the PlayStation 2, the Xbox was a pretty safe bet if you wanted a game that was fully meant to be multi-platform to run its best here reliably. So we did get quite a few unique experiences that could either only be possible on the most powerful console of that generation or simply were no-brainers to have on here. Obviously, the conversation begins with Halo. This was the game to own on the Xbox. I can't think of any game that looks or really plays like Halo, as this game is just unique. This is a beautifully stylized game with very deep and interesting lore, with an objectively fantastic gameplay, and it only got better with Halo 2, as well as it received an upgrade in just about every way possible. This is when Halo really took online seriously, and it was another major reason why you would want to play this game, right after the incredible narrative, of course. They added the ability to play as the Arbiter, which added a whole new perspective that we hadn't explored before in order to gain a better understanding of the lore that had been built up to this point. Another game I thought was awesome was Thief: Deadly Shadows. This is a stealth game, in fact, the first one that I ever played that was like this. This is a first-person game where you have to sneak into places to steal stuff. This game required me to unlock a certain amount of patience I never realized I even had, just considering how much of a learning curve its mechanics offered, but it was such a fun and unique experience that I would surely go back and replay it. Now, Fable was another massive game on the Xbox that was nicely stylized but offered such an interesting gameplay loop where you would begin playing as a child and eventually grow up into two different paths depending on your decisions throughout the game. And of course, Morrowind is one of the most interesting titles for myself as somebody that enjoys character customization and exploration all throughout. The Xbox was home to some massive games that are somewhat doubtful if they could ever even be a good home anywhere else. Other games that were important during its run were Forza Motorsport, Knights of the Old Republic, Half-Life 2, Ninja Gaiden Black, Shenmue 2, Just Cause, Psychonauts, Time Splitters, Splinter Cell, Jet Set Radio Future, Doom 3, Dead or Alive 3, and we even saw Silent Hill 2 make it onto the original Xbox. But a very important aspect to the original Xbox was of course how it implemented its online services during this era. The 6th generation console race is partially known for its introduction to online gaming when it came to console gaming, but the Xbox was the one that had the best handle on its online ecosystem. Now, the Gamecube barely had online support, and the Dreamcast only had a few games that cared about online whatsoever, while the PlayStation 2 did have quite a few games that supported online features, even if it wasn't the best service because publishers were made in charge of sustaining their servers. But the Xbox was the first one to charge a subscription fee to play online, and it came at the cost of $49 per year as it was, and still is known as Xbox Live. However, because of this, the Xbox had the best and most consistent online experiences available on any console. This was the case because Microsoft was in charge of sustaining online servers. The Xbox was the most forward-thinking concept of the early 2000s in terms of console gaming, and it really did set an important precedent for what the online console gaming landscape would look like in the future. This was part of what made the Xbox so appealing to so many people. The Xbox had an incredible start, and especially an amazing run throughout its time, and it achieved a lot more than what some expected. The competition was certainly still offering many things that were unique to them, and the Xbox technically had to answer to 3 competitors that had been involved in gaming for quite some time. This is what the competition was like. When the Dreamcast first launched, it did sell really well, considering that it was next-generation hardware that came out in 1998, and the rest of the competition wasn't ready until the new millennia began. But regardless of this early start, as Sega usually was the earliest to the party, they did not last very long. The PlayStation 2 launched in the year 2000, and the Gamecube made an appearance in August of that same year, while the Xbox was being announced in January of 2000. All of these were shown off as being more powerful systems, and with Microsoft Microsoft being such a titan in the tech industry and being a company that could simply toss loads of their massive earnings at this console to support it as much as possible, the Dreamcast was being overshadowed so very quickly. So the Dreamcast was discontinued in March of 2001, over 6 months before the Xbox and GameCube would eventually launch. And then software support for this platform was also dwindled with time. So before the Xbox and GameCube even showed up, there was one competitor that left the race. So for the most part, this meant that the PlayStation 2, the GameCube, and Xbox were going head-to-head during this competition. But even though Nintendo had such a strong presence in the console gaming industry, their sales had been dwindling over the course of the few generations that they had been competing in. And the GameCube did disappoint in terms of sales. Nintendo had awesome games on their platform, and they did have more third-party support on the GameCube than they did on the Nintendo 64. But the reality was that they were not being supported as much as the Xbox and PlayStation 2 were. On top of that, online was far from a priority for Nintendo, which caused the GameCube to feel a little bit dated, and that the only way to enjoy multiplayer was through couch co-op for the most part. Then the PlayStation 2 had an overwhelming library of third-party support, as well as some other incredible online titles such as Final Fantasy XI. The PlayStation 2 did have a lot of potential because of its Emotion Engine chip, but it was difficult to work with, which meant that games did usually look worse on the PlayStation 2 than they did on other platforms whenever they were placed on multiple platforms. But the Xbox had the best performance and best visuals overall, while also embracing online gaming. But this generation, it was clear that Microsoft had been making moves to move past this experimental phase of the Xbox and advance into something special. Now, regarding everything I just mentioned about the GameCube, that's just one of a few reasons why the GameCube did not do so well, and I would even say that it failed. But the Xbox was an amazing contender, but that's about it for that. The Xbox attracted more mature audiences, similarly to the PlayStation 2, while the GameCube was seen as a console for children. The Xbox did accomplish a lot during its run because of how unique the hardware was, specifically for gamers. The PlayStation 2 had everything, but it didn't always have the best versions of games. The PlayStation 2 sold exceptionally well, due in part because of it being a full DVD player that was cheaper than other dedicated players while also playing current-gen games. It was exactly what people at that time wanted, and so it would be very difficult to beat the PlayStation 2. But if the circumstances were different, then I'm sure that the Xbox would have been much closer in sales. While the PlayStation 2 sold 155 million units, although Google states that they sold 160 million units, the GameCube was in third place this generation, and a very distant one at that. The Xbox sold 24 million units, 3 million more than the GameCube did. The Xbox was important, and it simply couldn't be considered a failure even if it was close to the GameCube in sales because of what it was. This was an experimental console from a company that has never directly developed a gaming console, and that is much more expensive to make than what it sold, while also having a lot of features that became commonplace later on. It was a very successful experiment because it helped cement Microsoft and Xbox brand as strong competitors in the console gaming industry and got lots of third-party developers involved in their vision. So just as I mentioned earlier, the Xbox may have been pretty ahead of its time, but Microsoft had already been in the works when it came to their next generation system, and in fact, they were the first ones to make a very successful entry into the space before anyone else. This next one is my favorite Xbox of all time, and we will talk about it soon. So stay tuned and subscribe so that you don't miss my mini documentary on this incredible console. Now, thank you so much for watching. Leave your suggestions in the comments for future bite-sized documentaries. And until next time.